In January 2026, the United States government made a decision that most people never even heard about, and it could determine who controls the most powerful technology on Earth for the next decade. A single rule change buried in a federal filing redrew the boundaries of the global chip war. Within weeks, China responded with a weapon of its own: control over the rare earth minerals that every advanced chip factory on the planet depends on. Prices for some of those materials spiked by as much as 6 times in a matter of months. This isn't a story about the past. This is happening right now in 2026, with new developments breaking almost every month. Export bans reversed, then reinstated, then reversed again. A $600 billion industry being split in two before our eyes. Most people think this war is just about phones and laptops getting more expensive. It isn't. It's about which country writes the rules for artificial intelligence, military technology, and economic power for the rest of this century. And the strangest part, both sides may be about to lose control of it entirely. But to understand how we got here, and why the next 12 months may matter more than the last 5 years combined, we need to go back to where this all began. For decades, the semiconductor industry operated on an unspoken agreement. Chips would be designed in the United States, refined in Europe and Japan, and manufactured almost exclusively in one place, Taiwan. It was efficient, it was profitable, and it was, in hindsight, an extraordinary strategic vulnerability that almost no one wanted to talk about. That silence ended in October 2022. The United States Bureau of Industry and Security rolled out the first sweeping controls on advanced logic chips, chip-making equipment, and the software behind them, specifically targeting China's ability to acquire cutting-edge computing power. This wasn't a minor trade adjustment. It was designed to freeze an entire nation's semiconductor progress in place, at a level of severity that even some American officials admitted was unprecedented. The first target was AI hardware. Nvidia, the world's most valuable chip company, found itself at the center of a geopolitical storm it hadn't chosen. To keep serving its largest overseas market, Nvidia engineered a workaround, a chip called the H20, deliberately built to sit just below the new performance thresholds. For a while, it worked. Chinese technology giants like Alibaba, ByteDance, and Tencent kept buying at scale, and the illusion of business as usual held together. However, that illusion didn't survive long. In April 2025, the Trump administration closed the loophole entirely, banning even the scaled-down H20 chips outright. It was a clear signal. The era of calibrated workarounds was over, and Washington intended to draw a much harder line. But here's what almost nobody predicted. Cutting China off from the newest chips didn't stop its semiconductor industry. It forced it to improvise. SMIC, China's largest domestic chip foundry, began pushing its manufacturing processes to what analysts now describe as 7-nanometer and 5-nanometer class capability, using older deep ultraviolet lithography machines already inside the country before the toughest restrictions took hold. They accomplished this without access to the extreme ultraviolet lithography systems made by the Dutch company ASML, machines so complex that until recently, experts considered them irreplaceable for advanced chip production. The results were imperfect. Manufacturing this way meant higher costs, lower yields, and slower production cycles than the Western alternative. But it was progress nobody in Washington wanted to see. By 2025, SMIC's advanced node output was estimated at roughly 45,000 wafer starts per month, and analysts projected that figure could climb towards 60,000 per month by the end of 2026. Then another unexpected development occurred. In January 2026, the outgoing Biden administration's Bureau of Industry and Security published a final rule that tightened the entire system even further, introducing a new technical benchmark called total processing performance to determine, chip by chip, which products could legally be sold and which couldn't. It shifted the system away from blanket bans toward a case-by-case licensing regime, giving regulators more precision but also more power to slow down entire supply chains almost at will. China didn't wait to respond. Within weeks, Beijing rolled out its strictest ever restrictions on rare earth elements and permanent magnets, materials that sit quietly at the center of nearly every advanced chip and defense system in the world. For the first time, China applied what's known as a foreign direct product rule to these materials, meaning that any company anywhere on Earth using even trace amounts of Chinese-origin rare earths or Chinese-derived extraction technology now needed Beijing's approval to export their own finished products. The effect was immediate and brutal. Prices for certain rare earth materials spiked as much as sixfold. Licensing approval rates for European manufacturers trying to secure these materials fell below 25%. It was, in effect, a mirror image of the American strategy stance, using a critical choke point to apply pressure right back. The situation became even more complicated when Washington's own resolve appeared to waver. As 2026 progressed, the White House began quietly easing parts of its own chip strategy. With President Trump preparing for a high-profile visit to Beijing and pushing to stabilize broader trade negotiations, the administration suspended a rule requiring investigations into companies with ownership ties to blacklisted Chinese entities. It also relaxed licensing restrictions on Nvidia's high-performance H200 chip, a processor that had previously been barred from the Chinese market entirely. In December, Trump went further, announcing Nvidia would be permitted to sell H200 chips to China outright, alongside a new 25% tariff on the transaction. Experts immediately called the resulting framework contradictory, a policy that simultaneously restricted and permitted access to the same technology within the same set of rules. This didn't sit well with everyone in Washington. Congressional hawks saw it as a dangerous retreat. In February 2026, a bipartisan group of lawmakers wrote directly to the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of State, demanding a complete, countrywide ban on semiconductor manufacturing equipment sales to China, not just restrictions targeting specific blacklisted companies. Their argument was simple. Once a machine crosses into Chinese territory, the United States loses almost all ability to control how it's used. And notably, Dutch lithography equipment sales to China had reportedly doubled year over year for 2 consecutive years before tightening began. Then, in April 2026, Congress answered with what officials called the largest export control expansion in the history of the chip war. Roughly 20 new measures, including a bill known as the Match Act, aimed at cutting off Chinese chip makers from advanced manufacturing equipment altogether. Some of the most aggressive provisions were softened before the final vote, but restrictions on deep ultraviolet lithography exports remained firmly in place. But that wasn't the end of the loophole hunting. In June 2026, the Commerce Department issued new guidance clarifying that Chinese-headquartered companies operating through overseas subsidiaries in countries like Malaysia still required export licenses before receiving advanced AI chips. Regulators had grown concerned that shell operations outside China were being used to quietly acquire the very hardware the rules were designed to block. Nvidia stated publicly that it had already been operating within the clarified rules, though independent analysts questioned how many shipments may have slipped through before the clarification arrived. What does all of this add up to? Not a single winner and not a clean divide, but something analysts increasingly describe as a managed bifurcation. 2 separate technological ecosystems evolving in parallel, each dependent on different chip architectures, different manufacturing tools, and increasingly different AI infrastructure entirely. The economic stakes are staggering. One estimate from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation suggested that a full decoupling between the 2 systems could cost American chip makers as much as $77 billion in lost sales, with South Korea, the European Union, Taiwan, and Japan all absorbing significant losses of their own as global supply chains reroute around the divide. And yet, despite years of restrictions, most independent estimates suggest China's advanced chip production capacity still sits at somewhere between 1% and 4% of the United States and its allies combined, a gap that, according to some analysts, may actually be widening rather than closing as Western manufacturers continue to scale. So why hasn't the pressure simply worked? Some experts argue that hardware restrictions alone were never going to be enough. As algorithms become more efficient and AI developers find ways to do more with less computing power, raw chip access matters less than it once did. Add to that a persistent grey market, with brokers and intermediaries in third countries reportedly funneling restricted hardware across borders for profit. And the picture becomes far messier than a simple story of containment. The human and economic effects of this standoff reach far beyond boardrooms in Silicon Valley and Shenzhen. Consider the workers inside the fabrication plants themselves, highly specialized engineers whose expertise took a decade or more to build, now finding their employers forced to choose between markets almost overnight. Consider the smaller nations caught in the crossfire, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam among them, suddenly thrust into the spotlight as potential transshipment points, their own trade relationships scrutinized by both Washington and Beijing for signs of leakage. A country that simply wants to build its own electronics assembly industry now finds itself forced to prove, shipment by shipment, that it isn't secretly enabling a rival superpower's access to restricted technology. Then there's the effect on price. Consumers rarely see the chip war directly, but they feel it indirectly in the cost of everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to the cloud computing services that power the apps on their phones. When rare earth prices spike sixfold, that cost doesn't simply vanish. It moves through the supply chain, landing eventually on products most people never think to connect to a policy dispute happening in Washington or Beijing. For financial markets, the stakes are just as real. Semiconductor companies exposed to Chinese revenue now carry what analysts describe as a permanent risk premium, a discount investors apply because regulatory whiplash has become the new normal rather than the exception. A company's earnings can shift dramatically based not on how many chips it sells, but on a single Commerce Department filing or a single social media post from a head of state. That kind of volatility used to be reserved for currencies and commodities. Now it's a defining feature of one of the world's most important industries. There's also a quieter, longer-running story beneath the headlines, the race to build entirely separate AI ecosystems. China's technology giants, cut off from the newest American chips, have poured resources into homegrown alternatives, domestic AI accelerators, indigenous software stacks, and entire cloud computing platforms built to function without a single component that requires American approval to acquire. It's slower, it's more expensive, but it's a hedge against a future where reliance on American technology simply isn't an option anymore, regardless of what any future administration decides. And that's precisely why some analysts believe the current back and forth, ban, then relax, then retighten, may ultimately matter less than the deeper trend underneath it. Both sides are building redundancy into their own systems, so that neither one is left as vulnerable to the other's next policy move. In a strange way, the very unpredictability of the chip war may be accelerating the very separation both governments claim they're trying to manage. At the center of it all sits Taiwan, home to the most advanced chip manufacturing on the planet, and the single point of failure the entire global economy still quietly depends on. Every policy shift in Washington, every retaliation from Beijing, and every new loophole closed in between ultimately circles back to the same uncomfortable question. What happens to the world's technology supply if that single point of failure is ever disrupted? To understand why Taiwan carries so much weight, it helps to look at how the rest of the supply chain is caught in the middle. For years, foreign chip makers running factories inside China, including TSMC, Samsung, and SK Hynix, operated under a special American exemption known as Validated End User Status. It let them receive US-controlled manufacturing equipment without applying for a fresh export license every single time. In early 2026, that exemption quietly expired. Samsung and SK Hynix were shifted onto annual licenses instead, a change that sounds bureaucratic but carries real consequences. An annual license can simply not be renewed. It introduces a permanent layer of uncertainty into what used to be a stable, predictable arrangement. And it means two of the world's most important memory chip makers now operate one government decision away from disruption. The Netherlands finds itself in an equally uncomfortable position. ASML remains the only company on Earth capable of producing the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines required for the most advanced chips. Washington has pressured the Dutch government for years to fall in line with American restrictions, while Beijing represents one of ASML's largest and most lucrative markets. Japan faces the same dilemma. Tokyo has already added 23 separate items to its own export control list at Washington's urging, and a proposed law in the US Congress, known as the Match Act, is designed to pull allied nations even further into alignment. But every country asked to comply faces the same trade-off: side with the United States, and risk losing access to one of the largest chip markets in the world. Meanwhile, The United States has been trying to reduce its own exposure to Chinese leverage over critical minerals through an initiative called Pax Silica, a partnership aimed at developing alternative sources of rare earths outside of China entirely. It's a long-term project and one that will take years, not months, to meaningfully shift global supply away from Beijing's control. Inside Washington, the disagreement isn't just between the US and China, it's within the US government itself. In January 2026, the House Foreign Affairs Committee advanced a bill called the AI Overwatch Act, which would strip the Commerce Department of its current authority to approve AI chip export licenses and hand that power directly to Congress. It's a direct response to what hawkish lawmakers see as an executive branch too willing to loosen restrictions for the sake of trade diplomacy. Whether that bill becomes law could determine who actually controls America's chip strategy for years to come: the White House or Congress. Underneath all of this policy maneuvering is a simple, sobering calculation from industry analysts. Even in a scenario where Nvidia's most advanced chips flow freely into China, the United States and its allies would still hold somewhere between a 21-1 and 49-1 advantage in effective computing capacity. The gap isn't just about who has the newest chip. It's about who can produce it at scale, reliably, year after year, and on that measure, the distance between the two sides may be harder to close than either government's public statements suggest. What began in 2022 as a targeted set of export restrictions has become something far larger, a structural realignment of the global semiconductor industry that few predicted and even fewer fully control. The United States tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. China absorbed the pressure, built workarounds at real cost, and then found its own choke point to press back with. Congress and the White House don't even fully agree with each other on how hard to push. And underneath all of it, the grey market keeps moving hardware across borders that official policy insists are closed. Here's why it matters beyond the headlines. This isn't simply a dispute over trade figures or tariffs. It's a contest over who builds the artificial intelligence systems that will shape economies, militaries, and daily life for the next generation. Every restriction, every workaround, and every rare earth retaliation is really a move in a much longer game. One where the prize is technological leadership itself. Think about what's actually at stake beneath the surface. Whoever leads in advanced computing doesn't just sell more phones or faster laptops. They set the standards other nations build on top of. They shape which countries' AI models train the next generation of software engineers, doctors, and researchers. They determine whose military gets the computational edge in an era where artificial intelligence increasingly decides outcomes on the battlefield before a single shot is fired. This is why a dispute that started with export paperwork has grown into something closer to a modern arms race, quieter than a military build-up, but arguably just as consequential. Experts remain divided on what comes next. Some believe the current uneasy balance, restrict, retaliate, relax, repeat, will hold for years, allowing both sides to keep negotiating without a full rupture. Others argue that the underlying trajectory is unmistakable. Two separate technology ecosystems, increasingly incompatible, increasingly self-contained, and increasingly unable to be reunified even if political will to do so eventually appears. And a smaller number warn that the real danger isn't the chip war itself, but what happens if the shared point of dependency at the center of it all, Taiwan's manufacturing capacity, is ever seriously disrupted. Looking ahead, most analysts agree on a few likely trajectories, even if they disagree on the details. Expect continued volatility in Washington's policy stance, as trade diplomacy and national security priorities keep pulling in opposite directions. Expect China to keep investing heavily in domestic alternatives, even at a higher cost and slower pace, simply to reduce its exposure to any single foreign supplier. Expect allied nations like Japan, South Korea, and the Netherlands to remain stuck in the middle, balancing pressure from Washington against the economic reality of the Chinese market. And expect Taiwan to remain the industry's most closely watched pressure point, since almost every scenario analysts model for the next decade still runs through the island's fabrication plants in one way or another. What's clear is that this story is far from finished. New rules, new loopholes, and new countermeasures are emerging on a timeline measured in months, not years, and the decisions being made right now may still be rewritten by the time you watch this. So here's the question worth sitting with. In a contest where both sides keep changing the rules faster than anyone can enforce them, is either country actually winning, or are we simply watching two superpowers build separate futures they can no longer undo? Let us know in the comments what you think happens next, and whether you believe this divide can still be reversed, or whether it's already permanent. If you want to understand the forces quietly reshaping the technology in your pocket, in your car, and in your country's military, subscribe for more documentaries covering the developments as they unfold.